Hi, I'm Mr. Walberg, and I'm glad you're here. Today we're going to resume our discussion of APUS history with the changing economic conditions and social conditions of Americans at the end of the 19th century. We're going to discuss how it affects farmers, how it affects the urban workers, and also African Americans and women. Turn with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear, when out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of Walberg's APUSH. History class rides again! We have 4 objectives. By the end of this class, you should be able to understand the origins and significance of populism. You should be able to characterize the conditions of workers in the 1890s. You should be able to describe how the people and issues of the 1896 presidential election, and you should be able to explain how African Americans faced legal segregation across the South after 1877. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 7. Farmers were facing increasing economic insecurity. You'll remember in our last class that farmers were, oftentimes they were, breaking new ground and planting new farms, but with the increased agricultural production came other problems like marketing grain and getting it to buyers. There was more grain and more food being produced, but at greater cost. The shipping and transportation and then reaching the market was driving down prices, and the economic instability of farmers really left them without a lot of answers. Their first attempt was to go form the Grange. Today we're going to talk about a couple other issues because farmers were facing increasing economic insecurity. Take, for instance, the South. When the South stopped exporting cotton during the Civil War, farmers abroad started growing cotton. And when they did that, it led to a glut of production after the war. After the war was over, prices fell by half and plunged farmers deep into debt. Good farmland was also becoming scarce. We had mentioned in our last class how so many more farms were coming into existence, but honestly, not all of that was on very good farmland. And it was sometimes farmers were working pretty hard to go put out any kind of a result for it. Farm foreclosures were increasing when farmers couldn't make their loan payments, and railroad prices for shipping and storage were particularly high. Farmers thought to improve their condition through the Farmers Alliance, whereas the Grange was a bargaining technique for dealing with, transportation issues, but also kind of some business issues. The Farmers Alliance was a different approach. It was more cooperative and focused on education, but also political efforts, not just an economic alliance. Subpoint B. During the Civil War, the United States issued around $500 million in a currency known as greenbacks. It was paper money that could not be exchanged for silver or gold, unlike hard money, which had some kind of, a precious metal backing it up, usually gold, sometimes silver as well. Greenbacks were worth less than hard money for the same value. Merchants would sometimes require, if you're going to pay in greenbacks, you pay a higher price for it. It just took more to get the same amount of value for hard money, which could be exchanged for gold. After the Civil War, the United States government pulled the greenbacks out of circulation, basically in an effort to remove them, but also to drive down inflationary pressures that comes whenever you print new money. But that made the value of the remaining currency grow. It's just a supply and demand deal. There was fewer supply of currency. There's a smaller supply of currency on there, which drove up the value of currency. It made the dollar worth more. It's the opposite of inflation. It's deflation. But people who had, take farmers who had gone into debt to go buy farms are suddenly having to pay back their debt in dollars that are worth more than the dollars they bought it in. It was a rare moment where the future payoff is more expensive in just absolute dollar sense than it was in the original way. At the same time, they were saving less money for all of their crops, right? While they're growing crops, they're receiving less money, but they have to go pay back loans at a higher rate or at a higher dollar value. Not a higher rate. It wasn't an interest change on it, but it was an inflation rate on it. Or deflation. Then farmers begged the government to go create inflation by issuing more money. To create inflation would be to go, basically manage debt. And what's now probably a boring piece of economic policy, but it was the government's approach to it. The 1878 Bland-Allison Act required that the government buy and coin at least $2 to $4 million worth of silver every month. It wasn't really enough to stem off the inflationary demands of agriculture. Subpoint C. The People's Party emerged from the Farmers Alliance in the 1890s. The People's Party is the same thing as the Populist Party. Those terms are interchangeable. And you usually hear it as the Populist Party. The Populist Party emerged from the Farmers Alliance in the 1890s, and it claimed to speak for all of the producing classes, not just farmers, but even the urban workers, the production class. The populists embarked on this remarkable effort of community organization and education. Large gatherings of people on the plains rallied against the power of banks and the political establishment. Populists embraced all kinds of modern technologies, the railroad, the telegraph, the national market, and they pushed federal government to regulate them in the public interest. Not only should they work in the public interest, but the federal government should manipulate those things to work in the public interest. The populist platform of 1892 remains a classic document of American reform. It's got, great phrasing and rhetoric. It's almost poetic. It also included a long list of proposals to reform democracy and opportunity that I think we moderns oftentimes might agree with or appeal to. Subpoint D, the populist coalition made remarkable efforts to unite black and white small-time farmers on a common political and economic program. While many black people refused to abandon the party of Lincoln, others were attracted by the populist program. African-American people were often unwelcome in the Farmers Alliance, and so they formed a parallel organization called the Colored Farmers National Alliance to meet their goals. The populist movement also engaged the energies of thousands of reform-minded women with farm and labor backgrounds. Here I'd like to introduce Mary Elizabeth Lease, the first female lawyer in Kansas and a prominent organizer who often told farmers that they should raise less corn and more hell, that it was about agitation for their interests. In 1992, James Weaver was the populist candidate for president, and that year he won more than 1 million votes nationwide, carrying 5 western states and 22 electoral votes, electing 3 governors and 15 congressmen. My own favorite state of Kansas was quite involved in the populist movement of this time. Subpoint E. Change in the women's movement also was reflecting the same combination of expanding activities and narrowing boundaries. Almost every state gave women the right to control their own wages and property and contracts and wills, giving some legal equality along the way. Around 5 million women were working for wages by the turn of the century, mostly young women and mostly in traditional jobs like domestic service and the garment industry, but some were taking jobs in better paying roles like clerical roles and professional work, making entries into the business world. Still, though, women lacked the right to vote, and that wouldn't be recognized kind of for a while. Through a network of women's clubs and temperance associations and social reform organizations, women had a growing influence on public life. Here we refer back to the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, which became the largest organization in 1890 with 150,000 members nationwide. It was led by Frances Willard, and the WCTU sparked a new prohibition crusade, going into saloons and singing and praying and urging saloon keepers to stop selling alcohol. Using the motto of do everything, which is a really big motto, do everything, the WCTU opened kindergartens for immigrants and visited inmates in prisons and asylums and worked for women's suffrage. Roman numeral number 8. Here we're going to talk about some conditions for workers. So this is more of an urban area than a farming area, although there's some interesting overlaps on it. The membership in the Knights of Labor, the first real great labor union, dropped pretty sharply after the Haymarket riots, and people that even were interested in labor causes didn't necessarily want to be a part of something that would be tied up or blamed for or associated with the Haymarket riots. And so a number of unions were organized in the place of the Knights of Labor, not the Knights of Columbus, not a labor organization. The rise in the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, but not that AFL, the American Federation of Labor, shifted away from trying to create a cooperative, utopian society of workers to more limited goals, but more attainable ones of providing business unionism to improve the life of their members. It was led by Samuel Gompers, and the AFL used collective bargaining for better wages and for better hours and for better working conditions. After successful strikes, the AFL won higher pay and a shorter work week, and the AFL one of the more successful labor unions because it was almost more of like a middle path union. It was a moderate that brought together different groups who were willing to work together. Subpoint B. In 1893, there was a severe economic downturn and a depression that came with it that led to increased conflict between capital, traditional like business owners, and labor, the workers, as employers used government power to go intimidate workers. Maybe the best example of this is the 1894 Coxey's Army incident, where Jacob Coxey was an Ohio businessman and politician and led a pretty good-sized group of unemployed people to go march on Washington to demand economic relief. It was seeing what looked like a horde of unemployed angry men storming the Capitol. Federal troops were called in to disband Coxey's army. It didn't go super well. Subpoint C. Here I want to introduce George Pullman. George Pullman was a railroad magnate, having invented the sleeping cars that allowed passengers to make long-distance rail travel, basically rolling hotel rooms. To build his famous sleeper cars, he founded a company town, a neighborhood of Chicago, which is still known as Pullman, Chicago. The neighborhood was wholly owned by George Pullman, with safe and modern row houses, really kind of nice places to live. They had, modern gas piping and indoor plumbing, and workers had to pay to live there. It was rent, so they paid rent to go live in Pullman, Pullman town. And they had to agree to behavior standards, but basically it was nice, reasonably affordable, good place to live, and, close to work. During the Depression that followed the Panic of 1893, though, the sales of Pullman cars dropped pretty sharply, and the business took a pretty dramatic downturn. And George Pullman laid off hundreds of workers and reorganized how the work was done. And even sometimes the workers that stayed were receiving less money. They took pay cuts to stay there. But despite those cutbacks, the Pullman Car Company didn't reduce rents for workers who lived in the town of Pullman. So they're making less money, or perhaps not making any money at all, but the same person that just laid them off or gave them pay cuts isn't lowering the price of their cost of living within rent, and a lot of workers felt pretty double screwed by that. It prompted workers to go strike between the American Railway Union, which was led by Eugene V. Debs. That's a name worth remembering. He's going to show up a few more times in our story. Eugene V. Debs against the Pullman Company, but also against the main railroads and the federal government of the United States under President Grover Cleveland. And the strike wasn't just in the Pullman neighborhood of Chicago. It eventually stretched out across the country. And when the union refused to negotiate, violence broke out. Eventually, the Cleveland administration had to call in Army troops and the United States federal marshals to go break up the strike. Clashes turned violent, killing around 34 people on both sides. The strike ended when Eugene V. Debs was jailed for violating a court order to disperse. He, was told to disperse, and he refused to do so. He appealed the decision all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, who upheld his conviction and the other convictions, the use of court orders against strikers. They said, you're going to lose this one. Debs was eventually released from prison, and when he was released, he was greeted by 100,000 people who met him at the prison gates and considered him a working man's hero. Subpoint D. Populists tried to make determined efforts to appeal to industrial workers, but honestly failed to get labor support. Populist issues like bimetallism and lowering mortgage rates didn't appeal to the urban workers, as it probably would have hurt in the urban class. Huge numbers of working class voters in 1894 shifted en masse to the Republican Party rather than the Populist Party. The Populist Party just really didn't speak to the urban poor very well. And here's where I'd like to introduce Roman numeral number 9, William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan, one of my favorite people in American history. He's a fascinating figure. His political issues, whatever, they're arranged, and some things are things we don't cheer on anymore. But not that he was a bad dude, just like his politics aren't modern politics. But he's one of my favorite people. His story is so fascinating. He was a Nebraska Democratic politician who had a broad support from the populist political party. He was a Democrat, but I think his heart was with the populist. I think that's probably the best way to interpret it. I think he really wanted the populist cause to succeed, but he was with a winning team when he was with the Democrats, and the populists had a longer road to hoe to get there. In 1896, he appeared at the Democratic National Convention. Basically, there was like a scheduling error, and there was a period of time where there was no speaker scheduled to come on, and they said, William Jennings Bryan, you're a talker. Can you go fill 30 minutes? And he gets up and he delivers a 30-minute, I don't know how much of it was pre-written, how much of it was extemporaneous, how much was totally off the cuff, and how much were like segments of it, polished. Rhetors and public speakers kind of have parts of all of those things. But he gave a 30-minute speech known as the Cross of Gold speech, a speech at the Democratic National Convention on the importance of the free coinage of silver. Basically, it was kind of a nerdy talk about economic policy and monetary policy and how to increase inflation by not only having gold-valued dollars, but dollars which could be backed by silver as well, which would increase the money supply and increase inflation. And it's not terribly complicated economics, but it's a little wonky to give a 30-minute speech. But it was a rousing success. The big crescendo lines on him said, you should not lay upon labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify us upon a cross of gold. And that's the speech that's known by us today, the Cross of Gold. He walked off stage to thundering applause, and everybody says, we should nominate William Jennings Bryan for president. And the Democratic Party takes this guy who had been a kind of a minor, Nebraska politician and nominate him to be the United States president in 1896. So that's where we meet William Jennings Bryan. The speech was so compelling, by the way, that he was also nominated by the Populist Party to be the populist candidate for president. So he was running for president on two different political tickets at the same time, which is not a good political strategy. The Republicans, subpoint B, nominated the Ohio governor, William McKinley. Ohio, a state that's actually pretty important politically, even though it's easy to forget because Ohio's, I'm going to get in trouble for this, kind of a nothing burger otherwise, but it's there's surprisingly a lot of people in Ohio. Anyway, they nominated the Ohio governor, William McKinley, and McKinley, totally different guy than William Jennings Bryan. If William Jennings Bryan is the populist and the spokesman of the little guy, William McKinley is strong backing by business interest. He represents the financial elite, the powers of the country. William Jennings Bryan was an economic radical, but William McKinley, on the other hand, advocated financial stability and business protection and a steady hand instead of chaos. The election of 1896 is sometimes called the first modern presidential campaign. William Jennings Bryan invented the whistle stop campaign, traveling to cities and in trains, and they had this like platform on the back of the train that he would walk out and give a speech on, and then the train would go off to the next city. Along the way, he would take up a collection from the people and pose for pictures or whatever, but give the same stump speech in every city and try to drive up national support. William McKinley, by contrast, almost never left his home in Ohio. There was a train station not far away, and train industries, remember, trains are the only big business, and McKinley is a big business kind of candidate. So railroads would give discounted tickets to travel to McKinley's home, and then he gave speeches from his front porch as people came to him. McKinley hired a professional campaign manager, a guy named Mark Hanna, who did impressive fundraising. Basically, what is that, a 7-to-1 outspending there, raising $3.5 million for the McKinley campaign to William Jennings Bryan about $500,000, and spent it on a national campaign of pamphlets and posters and advertisements and buttons. McKinley's victory, and it was a victory, shattered the political stalemate that had persisted since 1876 and created one of the most enduring political majorities in American history. Incidentally, the book The Wonderful Wizard of Oz is oftentimes seen as a commentary on the 1896 election and its issues. Go look it up on Wikipedia, but it makes more sense if you remember that in the book, Dorothy's slippers weren't ruby, they were silver. It was the path out of the troubles. And William Jennings Bryan was the model for the wizard, the guy that knew the way back home, back to Kansas and back to the farm people. Roman numeral number 10. Upon achieving power, the Redeemers moved to undo Reconstruction as much as possible. You remember the Redeemers. They were part of our Period 5, the people that came at the end of Reconstruction, and the idea was they were going to redeem the South for the old powers of the South and get rid of the Northerners and the Republicans, the carpetbaggers who had swept in and taken unfair control. The Redeemers were going to return the South to the way that it was back in the antebellum, back in the before the war era. They moved in to undo Reconstruction as much as possible. The public school systems were the hardest hit. New laws authorized the arrest of virtually any person who without employment and greatly increased the penalties for petty crimes. Basically, not having a job was grounds for arrest. It became illegal to do that, to not have that. And the South, on the whole, sank deeper and deeper into poverty. Subpoint B. As the most disadvantaged rural Southerners, African-American farmers suffered the most from the region's condition. African-Americans owned less land in 1900 than they did at the end of Reconstruction. A fascinating idea that they owned less land by the turn of the century than they did immediately after the Civil War. The Upper South had, of course, we've talked about this a lot, the more diversified economy, the iron mines, the iron furnaces, the tobacco factories that offered employment to black people. But along the rural coast and in the Deep South, the parts that were hardest hit by the Civil War, there the economy was so destroyed, and the premature end of Reconstruction made it basically impossible to find. Got some echoing out of here. Oh, that's my thing. Let me turn that off. It's rattling the whole deal. Okay. Where are we at here? They were so destroyed by the Civil War and the premature end of Reconstruction, it made it basically impossible to find financing to go repair the damage, leaving African-American laborers jobless and ready to leave. And remember, not having a job was grounds for arrest. Cities supported the growth of a black middle class. Schools and colleges and churches and businesses, social clubs all supported African Americans in professional life, but still black people were barred from skilled and supervisory positions, and the labor market remained rigidly segregated. In what was seen as the Kansas Exodus, my favorite state, promoters circulated pamphlets describing Kansas as a land of rural plenty, and many African Americans migrated to Kansas for political equality, education, and freedom from violence and economic opportunity. Still, most African Americans had very little opportunity but to stay in the South, and not much of a way out. Most northern employers refused to offer jobs to black people. Subpoint C. Let's talk about the decline of African-American politics, as office holding and voting for African-Americans didn't suddenly end with Reconstruction in 1877, but political opportunity became more restricted. The banner of political leadership was passed to African-American women activists, most notably the National Association of Colored Women. Then between 1890 and 1906, every southern state enacted laws or constitutional provisions meant to eliminate the African-American vote. These included literacy tests, poll tests, demonstrating an understanding of the state constitution. All states also adopted what was known as a grandfather clause, because they're going to put up all these barriers that might also keep white people out of the polls, and they don't want to do that. So they come up with this thing known as a grandfather clause, which says that if a person whose grandfather was eligible to vote, then they didn't have to go be subject to the literacy tests and the poll taxes and the demonstrating the state constitution. But remember, the only people whose grandfather would have been able to vote were white people. Black people didn't have the right to vote, in that generation. Numerous poor and illiterate white people also lost the right to vote, the ones that couldn't even figure out, I don't mean to sound that cynically, but also didn't have access to the grandfather clause. Subpoint D. In 1896, the United States Supreme Court ruled what is considered one of the worst Supreme Court decisions ever in American history, Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson happened when Homer Plessy tried to board a train car. Homer Plessy was a very small percentage of African American, but using the idea of one drop of black blood makes you black. He was not allowed to go ride in the white rail cars in what some people have described as a Rosa Parks of his era. He tried to board the train and get into the white car. There he was publicly arrested, and he appealed it all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, who ruled against him. The Plessy versus Ferguson decision was an 11-1 decision that said that separate but equal would count, and that you take something like a rail car, and maybe one car is better, like a nicer car than the other, but they're both on the same train, and they're both going to arrive in the same city at the same time, and so it's equal. It's not like somebody's going to be late. It's equal transportation. Everybody's going to get there at the same time. Separate but equal is, of course, not ever equal. It's just inherently always so. But John Marshall Harlan was the lone dissenter on the court. He famously wrote that the Constitution was colorblind. States, though, loved the Plessy decision and basically swooped into passing laws mandating racial segregation in every aspect of Southern life, and even non-Southern states took advantage of it as well. The point, though, wasn't so much to keep the races apart, although it did do that, as to ensure that when they came in contact, that black people always felt like they were inferior. It was really about social control more than it was I'm not sure there's a justifiable excuse for separate but equal, but the practical thing was to just always be reminding black people that the world saw them as less. Subpoint E. Black people sought to challenge the system or refused to accept the demeaning behavior that was a daily feature of Southern life, faced real violence. And every year between 1883 and 1905, more than 50 people were lynched. Lynching is murder. It's murder execution style. It looks like capital punishment, but it's not, because it's not just. It's hordes of people. It's mobs of people. Usually, the method would go is they would accuse some black man of raping a white woman, and sometimes you didn't even need a white woman to say that she was raped. It was just enough to go get a rumor going, and they would go capture a black man, accuse him of rape. I thought that they needed to preserve the purity of white womanhood, and that was a justification for extra legal vengeance. Now remember, this is extra legal. It's not something being done by cops and courts. It's just by hordes and mobs of people. Many critics noted that the charge of rape was really just a convenient excuse, or what muckraking journalist Ida B. Wells called a bare lie. It didn't need even to be true to happen. Subpoint F. The Civil War eventually became remembered as a tragic family quarrel among white Americans, in which slavery played just a minor role. School history books emphasize happy slaves and the evils of Reconstruction, and people, my generation you would still hear this. I'm not sure you hear it so much anymore, but I remember hearing the Civil War wasn't fought about slavery. It was fought about states' rights. And it's the states' rights to do what? Anyway, subpoint G. Here I want to introduce, it's, every now and then it's kind of nice to end on a happy one. Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was a former slave, turned eventually to the president of Tuskegee Institute, today Tuskegee University, a college for black people. He and other reformers, now Washington was a moderate reformer. There would be other people trying to educate for civil rights in different ways, but he was a moderate reformer that often had white support. Booker T. Washington suggested that white people and black people could even work together for social progress and hoped that if African Americans had good paying jobs, the skills could bring economic equality and later social equality. Washington emphasized economic self-help and individual advancement into the middle class as an alternative to political protest and agitation, valuing vocational education over political equality as a long-term strategy. Booker T. Washington today sometimes gets a bad rap because he was a moderate rather than like a hardliner on it. But I hope that we also see that in the business of politics, there's several approaches. Anyway, that's a whole lot. That's episode 3. I have so much more to tell you, and I can't wait to tell you more. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.